Imagine building the fastest racing championship on Earth, only to watch foreigners come in, take everything, and leave with all the trophies. In the late 1960s, America created a racing series with almost no limits. There were no strict engine regulations, no horsepower caps, no budget restrictions. If you could build it, you could race it. Manufacturers responded by creating monsters producing more than 700 horsepower, more than Formula One cars by a massive margin. Everyone believed American engineering would dominate forever. After all, the championship belonged to America. The tracks were American. The fans were American. The money was American. Then, a small British team arrived. Not with the biggest factory, not with the biggest budget, but with a philosophy no one else understood. Within months, they didn't just start winning, they started destroying the competition. By the end of the season, America's greatest racing championship no longer belonged to America. It belonged to McLaren. If you love forgotten automotive stories that deserve Hollywood movies, you're in the right place. Welcome to Old Car Archives. Today, we're uncovering the unbelievable story of how one British team conquered America's fastest racing series and built one of the most dominant race cars ever created. The wildest racing series ever created before Formula One became the pinnacle of technology. There was another championship that was even more extreme. It was called Can-Am, officially the Canadian-American Challenge Cup, but nobody remembered it for the name. People remembered it because there were almost no rules, unlike Formula One, which tightly controlled engine sizes and vehicle specifications. Can-Am encouraged engineers to think bigger, much bigger. There were no practical limits on engine displacement. Almost any aerodynamic idea was legal. Designers experimented without fear. Manufacturers chased horsepower with almost reckless ambition. The result was absolute insanity. These machines weighed little more than a family sedan, yet produced enough power to embarrass many modern supercars. Drivers described them as almost impossible to control. Spectators loved every second. Can-Am quickly became known as the most brutal racing championship on Earth. For American manufacturers, it was the perfect stage to prove their dominance. Massive Chevrolet 5.8 engines thundered around circuits across North America. The crowd expected local teams to rule. No one imagined that the championship's greatest dynasty would come from a company based thousands of miles away. Two men with one crazy dream. Long before McLaren became a Formula One giant, it was little more than the dream of one extraordinary driver. His name was Bruce McLaren, born in New Zealand. Bruce wasn't the loudest driver. He wasn't the most famous. But among engineers, he earned something even more valuable: respect. Bruce believed racing wasn't just about driving. It was about understanding every bolt, every suspension component, every ounce of weight. He wanted cars that weren't simply powerful. He wanted them to be intelligent. Alongside him stood another brilliant mind, American engineer Tyler Alexander. Together, they built a team unlike any other. Small, efficient, obsessed with detail. While larger manufacturers relied on enormous budgets, McLaren relied on relentless engineering. Every improvement mattered, every test lap mattered, every gram mattered. That philosophy would soon produce a machine unlike anything America had ever faced. The birth of the M8B by 1969. McLaren already understood something their rivals didn't. Winning in Can-Am wasn't simply about adding more horsepower. Anyone could install a bigger engine. The real challenge was turning that power into speed. The answer became the McLaren M8B at first glance. It looked deceptively simple. Underneath, it was a masterpiece. Its lightweight aluminum monocoque chassis gave the car exceptional rigidity while keeping weight remarkably low. Behind the driver sat a gigantic Chevrolet Vue 8, producing around 680 to over 700 horsepower, depending on race configuration. The engine wasn't revolutionary. The way McLaren used it was. The car generated incredible traction, remarkable balance, and astonishing reliability. While competitors constantly battled mechanical failures, the M8B simply kept running. It wasn't the loudest innovation, it wasn't the most complicated, it was something much more dangerous. It worked every single weekend. When the green flag dropped, America expected another American victory. Instead, the orange McLaren disappeared into the distance. Race after race, the gap kept growing. Soon, the fans weren't asking who would win. They were asking, can anyone stop McLaren? The 1969 Can-Am season began with confidence. American teams had bigger garages, more mechanics, more money, and decades of experience racing powerful V8 machines. McLaren? They were still viewed as outsiders. Fast, yes, but nobody expected what happened next. When the first races got underway, the orange McLaren M8B didn't just lead, it disappeared, corner after corner, lap after lap. Bruce McLaren and teammate Denny Hume drove with almost surgical precision. The Chevrolet V8 thundered down the straights, but unlike the other cars, the M8B remained composed under braking. It carried incredible speed through corners, and while rivals burned through tires and overheated components, the McLaren simply kept pushing. By the time the checkered flag waved, the gap wasn't measured in meters. It was measured in disbelief. The secret nobody could copy. Many teams assumed McLaren had discovered some revolutionary engine trick. They tore apart engines, installed larger carburetors, experimented with bigger camshafts, chased more horsepower. But horsepower wasn't the answer. The real advantage was something much harder to duplicate: balance. Bruce McLaren believed every part of the car had to work together. More power meant nothing if the chassis couldn't control it. A lighter car wasn't enough if it became unstable. Every adjustment, every suspension angle, every aerodynamic surface was tested relentlessly. The M8B wasn't built around one magical invention. It was built around hundreds of tiny improvements, each one almost invisible. Together, they made the car nearly unbeatable. The orange cars took over America as the season continued. Something unusual started happening. Fans stopped asking, which American team will win? Instead, they looked for the orange cars. McLaren wasn't just winning races, they were controlling them. At circuits like Laguna Seca, Road America, Mid-Ohio, and Watkins Glen, the M8Bs became almost untouchable. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hume often finished first and second. Sometimes, they looked like they were racing each other, while everyone else raced for third place. American newspapers struggled to explain it. How could a relatively small British operation embarrass manufacturers with vastly larger resources? There was no scandal, no hidden technology, no illegal modifications, just better engineering. The car that never seemed to break. Can-Am Racing punished machinery harder than almost any other championship. Massive V8 engines generated incredible heat. Gearboxes shattered. Suspension components cracked. Drivers often retired before halfway. Yet the McLaren M8B kept surviving. Bruce believed reliability wasn't boring. Reliability won championships. Every unnecessary part was removed. Every weak component strengthened. Nothing stayed on the car unless it earned its place. While competitors spent weekends fixing broken machines, McLaren spent weekends collecting trophies. That difference became enormous over an entire season. Because in racing, you cannot win if you never reach the finish line. The psychological war. Soon, something even more dangerous happened. McLaren entered the minds of their rivals. Drivers lined up on the grid already expecting the orange cars to disappear. Engineers stopped asking, "How do we beat everyone?" They started asking, "How do we beat McLaren?" Every new car was designed around one goal: catch the M8B, yet every race seemed to end the same way. The orange cars vanished into the distance. The gap grew. Confidence disappeared. McLaren had done more than build the fastest car. They had become the standard everyone else was desperately trying to reach. The championship was already decided by the middle of 1969. The standings told a brutal story. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hume were collecting victories almost effortlessly. The championship wasn't becoming competitive, it was becoming predictable. Fans loved the speed, but rival teams feared what came next, because if McLaren continued improving at this pace, the rest of Can-Am might never catch them, and they were right. The domination was only beginning. Then, just as McLaren stood on top of the racing world, everything changed. A tragedy struck the team that no engineer could fix. The man who built the empire would never see how legendary it would become. By the end of the 1969 season, McLaren wasn't simply another racing team. It had become the team everyone feared. The orange cars had rewritten the Can-Am rulebook. Bruce McLaren had achieved something almost impossible. He had taken a small independent team across the world into America's biggest racing championship and beaten the giants on their own tracks. To fans, he was one of the fastest drivers in the world, but inside the garage, he was something much more important. He was the leader, the engineer, the test driver, the man who noticed the smallest vibration before anyone else could. Nothing left the workshop without his approval. He wasn't building cars for the next race, he was building cars for the future, and that future looked unstoppable. No one knew. It was about to change forever. On June 2nd, 1970, Bruce McLaren arrived at England's Goodwood circuit. It wasn't a race weekend. There were no grandstands full of cheering fans, no television cameras, just another ordinary test session. The team was preparing its next Can-Am machine, the McLaren M8D. Bruce climbed into the cockpit like he had done hundreds of times before. The V8 engine roared to life. He accelerated down the straight, collecting data, searching for tiny improvements. Then, at over 170 miles per hour, disaster struck. A section of the car's rear bodywork failed, without rear aerodynamic stability. The car instantly became uncontrollable. It veered violently off the circuit, hit a marshal's post, and crashed with devastating force. Bruce McLaren was only 32 years old. The news spread across the motorsport world within hours. The man who had built one of racing's greatest teams was gone. Everyone thought McLaren was finished inside the McLaren workshop. Silence replaced celebration. Mechanics who had worked beside Bruce for years struggled to believe he would never walk through the garage again. Many outsiders assumed the team's story had ended, because how do you replace someone who designed the cars, led the engineers, and drove them to victory? Sponsors questioned the future. Competitors expected McLaren to collapse. Some believed the Can-Am Championship would finally become competitive again. But they underestimated something Bruce had spent years creating: a culture. He had surrounded himself with people who believed in constant improvement, engineers who challenged every idea, mechanics obsessed with perfection, drivers who trusted the team completely. Bruce was gone, but his philosophy remained, and that philosophy refused to die. Instead of falling apart, McLaren became even stronger. Denny Hume stepped forward. The engineers carried Bruce's vision into every new design. The lessons learned from the M8B shaped the cars that followed: the M8D, the M8E, the M8F, each one faster than the last, year after year. The orange cars continued winning Can-Am championships. The domination became so complete that fans started calling the series the Bruce and Denny Show. It wasn't because one man was still driving. It was because Bruce McLaren's ideas were still winning races. His fingerprints remained on every championship trophy. His philosophy had become the team's greatest weapon. By the early 1970s, McLaren had turned America's greatest racing championship into its own playground. The orange cars were winning so often. Fans wondered if anyone would ever beat them again. But in the end, it wasn't another team that ended McLaren's reign. It was the championship itself. Bruce McLaren never lived to witness what his team would become, but perhaps he already knew, because by the time of his death, the blueprint had already been written. The McLaren M8B wasn't simply another successful race car. It became the foundation of one of the greatest dynasties motorsport had ever seen, season after season. The orange cars continued to dominate Can-Am. New rivals arrived. New engineers claimed they had finally built the machine capable of stopping McLaren. Every year, the same promise echoed through the paddock: this is the year McLaren loses. Every year, the orange cars proved them wrong. The M8B had created something much bigger than a championship-winning car. It had created a culture where innovation mattered more than reputation, where every tiny improvement could become the difference between victory and defeat. America's biggest teams had no answer. The most painful part for McLaren's rivals wasn't losing. It was understanding why they were losing. They had the same Chevrolet Phi 8 engines. Many had larger budgets. Some even hired engineers away from rival teams. Yet they still couldn't match McLaren, because McLaren had discovered something racing often forgets. Championships aren't won by horsepower alone. They're won by how every component works together. The M8B wasn't the most powerful machine on every weekend. It wasn't the most expensive. It was simply the most complete. Its lightweight chassis, balanced suspension, reliable engineering, and relentless development made it almost impossible to beat over an entire season. While competitors chased revolutionary breakthroughs, McLaren perfected the details. And in motorsport, the details decide history. Ironically, the team that conquered Can-Am couldn't save it. As the 1970s progressed, the championship began to change. Costs climbed higher every season. Manufacturers spent enormous sums chasing impossible levels of performance. Turbocharged engines arrived. Horsepower exploded beyond 1,000 horsepower. The cars became faster than anyone had imagined only a few years earlier, but greater speed came with greater expense. Sponsors began looking elsewhere. Manufacturers shifted priorities. Crowds slowly declined. The series that had once represented unlimited engineering could no longer sustain itself. By the late 1970s, Can-Am faded into history, not because the racing became boring, but because unrestricted innovation had become incredibly expensive. The greatest racing playground ever created simply became too difficult to maintain. Today, most people have never heard of the McLaren M8B. Ask someone about legendary McLarens, and they'll probably mention the McLaren F1, the P1, or Formula One championships. But long before those victories, there was this: a bright orange machine that crossed an ocean, walked into America's own championship, and changed everything. The M8B proved something timeless. You don't need the biggest company, the largest factory, or the deepest pockets to become legendary. You need a better idea. Bruce McLaren understood that. He never chased attention, he chased perfection. And because of that, his team built a legacy that still defines McLaren today. Every Formula One victory, every Le Mans triumph, every championship can trace part of its DNA back to one extraordinary Can-Am car. The M8B wasn't simply successful. It established the standard that every future McLaren would try to uphold. History usually remembers the winners, but sometimes it forgets how they won. The McLaren M8B didn't rely on revolutionary engines. It didn't rely on unlimited money. It relied on something far more powerful, an obsession with doing every small thing better than everyone else. While America believed horsepower would guarantee victory, McLaren proved intelligence could beat brute force. One small British team traveled thousands of miles from home, entered America's fastest championship, and didn't just compete, they dominated it. Not for one race, not for one season, but for an entire era. Because the greatest machines aren't always remembered for being the loudest, they're remembered for changing what everyone thought was possible. And that is exactly what the McLaren M8B did. If you enjoyed this forgotten chapter of automotive history, subscribe to Old Car Archives. Every week, we uncover the incredible stories behind the cars, engineers, and rivalries that changed motorsport forever. Because sometimes, the greatest legends are the ones history almost forgot.